March 1989, Ernesto Vargas, a 41-year-old gardener from Medellin, received unusual instructions from his employer, Pablo Escobar. Pablo wanted Ernesto to plant 500 trees across several of his properties, estates, farms, safe houses. But these weren't ordinary plantings. Before each tree went into the ground, Ernesto was to dig a deep hole, place a waterproof container at the bottom, cover it with soil, and then plant the tree on top. Pablo told Ernesto that these trees were an investment, that in 30 years, when the trees were mature and valuable, Pablo's children would harvest them. And beneath each tree, they'd find something that would make them rich. Ernesto didn't ask questions, just did what he was told. For 4 years, from 1989 to 1993, Ernesto planted 500 trees. And beneath each one, he buried a waterproof container filled with cash, gold, or documents. Then Pablo was killed in 1993, and Ernesto kept the secret for 32 years, until 2025, when one of Pablo's old properties was sold to developers who started cutting down the trees to build condominium. And beneath the first tree they removed, they found a container, then another, 500 trees, 500 containers, $47 million in cash and gold, and a letter from Pablo explaining why he'd hidden it this way. A letter that revealed a side of Pablo Escobar that nobody had ever seen before. Ernesto Vargas had been working as a gardener since he was 16 years old, had learned the trade from his father, who'd maintained gardens for wealthy families in Medellin for 40 years. Ernesto was skilled at his work, knew which plants thrived in which soil, how to design landscapes that looked natural but were carefully planned, how to make gardens that would last for decades. That skill, that long-term thinking, was what caught Pablo Escobar's attention. Pablo hired Ernesto in 1987 to maintain the gardens at Hacienda Napoles and several of his other properties. Ernesto did good work, kept the lawns perfect, maintained the flower beds, planted trees that would provide shade and beauty for years to come. And in 1989, Pablo approached Ernesto with a special project, a project that would require absolute discretion and careful execution. A project that Pablo said was for his children's future. I want you to plant 500 trees, Pablo told Ernesto. Different types: oak, mahogany, cedar, pine. Trees that will be valuable in 30 years. Trees that my children can harvest and sell when they need money. But before you plant each tree, I want you to bury something beneath. A container, waterproof, sealed, with something valuable inside. And I want you to keep a record of where each tree is planted and what's buried beneath it. Can you do that? Ernesto said yes. Didn't ask why Pablo wanted to hide things beneath. Didn't ask what was in the containers. Just understood that this was Pablo's way of protecting his work, of creating a treasure that couldn't be seized by the government, couldn't be stolen by rivals, couldn't be found by anyone who didn't know where to look. A treasure that would grow more valuable over time as the trees matured and as inflation made the hidden cash worth less, but the gold worth. Pablo gave Ernesto the 500 of them. Each one was a cylindrical waterproof tube, about 2 feet long and 6 inches in diameter, made of heavy-duty plastic with rubber seals. Inside each container was one of 3 things: cash, usually $50,000 to $100,000 in U.S. $100 bills; gold bars, usually 5 to 10 kilograms; documents, property deeds, bank account information, lists of people who owed Pablo money or favors. Ernesto's job was to plant the trees and bury the containers. Pablo gave him a list of properties where the trees should be planted. Some are Pablo's estates. Some are farms owned by associates. Some are public parks where Pablo had influence with local officials. The trees needed to be planted in places where they'd be maintained, where they'd survive for 30 years, where they wouldn't be cut down or removed. Ernesto chose the locations carefully, made sure each tree had good soil, adequate water, room to grow. Made sure the containers were buried deep enough that they wouldn't be disturbed by normal gardening, but shallow enough that they could be found if you knew where to look. For each tree, Ernesto followed the same process. Dig a hole 4 feet deep. Place the container at the bottom. Cover it with 1 foot of soil. Plant the tree. Water it. Mark the location on a map. Record what was in the container. By the end of 1993, Ernesto had planted all 500 trees, had buried $47 million in cash and gold and documents, had created a detailed map showing the location of every tree and what was beneath it, and had given that map to Pablo. 2 weeks later, Pablo was killed, and Ernesto became one of the few people who knew about the buried treasure. Pablo's family didn't know. Pablo had planned to tell them when the time was right, when the trees were mature, when it was safe to harvest the treasure. Pablo's associates didn't know. This was Pablo's private insurance policy, not something he shared with his organization. Only Ernesto knew, and Ernesto kept the secret. For 32 years, Ernesto watched the trees grow, continued to maintain some of them he could, watched as Pablo's properties were seized by the government, sold to new owners, repurposed, watched as some of the trees were cut down for development, watched as the treasure beneath them was presumably lost, buried under concrete things. But many of the trees survived, grew tall and strong, became part of the landscape, became so ordinary that nobody thought about what might be beneath. Ernesto retired in 2010, moved to a small town outside Medellin, lived on his pension and his savings, never told anyone about the trees, never tried to dig up the treasure himself. That would have been stealing from Pablo's children, and Ernesto was loyal to Pablo's memory. Never contacted Pablo's family to tell them about the map. He didn't have the map anymore. Pablo had taken it, and Ernesto assumed Pablo had given it to his family before he died. Ernesto just lived quietly, keeping the secret, waiting to see if anyone would ever discover what was buried beneath those 500 trees. In January 2025, 32 years after Pablo's death, a development company purchased one of Pablo's old estates on the outskirts of Medellin. The property had been seized by the government in 1993, had sat unused for years, and was finally being sold for private development. The company planned to build luxury condominium. The first step was clearing the land, cutting down the old trees, removing the landscaping, preparing the site for construction. The construction crew started with the largest trees, old oaks and mahoganies that Ernesto had planted in 1989 and 1990. When they cut down the first tree and used a backhoe to remove the stump and roots, the machine hit something hard. The operator stopped, dug carefully around the object, found a waterproof container, pulled it out, opened it. Inside was $75,000 in US $100 bills, vacuum-sealed in plastic, perfectly preserved after 32 years. The crew called the property owner. The owner called the police. The police opened an investigation. And then the crew cut down the second tree, found another container, $50,000 in cash. Then a third tree, gold bars worth $200,000. Then a fourth, then a fifth. Every tree on the property had a container buried beneath it. 23 trees total on that estate. $3 million in cash and gold. The news spread quickly. Other properties that had belonged to Pablo Escobar were investigated. Trees that had been planted in the late 1980s and early 1990s were examined, and more containers were found. At a farm in Envigado, 40 trees, $5 million. At a property near Hacienda Napoles, 60 trees, $8 million. At a public park in Medellin, where Pablo had funded the landscape, 30 trees for $1 million. By March 2025, investigators had found 187 of the original 500 trees, had recovered $28 million in cash and gold, and had discovered something else in one of the containers. A letter from Pablo Escobar, dated November 1993, 1 month before his death. The letter was addressed to his children, Juan Pablo and Manuela, and it explained everything. The letter read, "My dear children, if you're reading this, it means I am dead. It means you have found the trees. It means Ernesto kept his promise and planted all 500 of them, and you have been smart enough or lucky enough to discover what is beneath. I planted these trees for you, not for me. I will never see them mature. I will never harvest the treasure beneath them. This is for you, for your future, for the life you will have after I am gone. I know that when I die, the government will seize everything, will take my properties, my money, my businesses, will leave you with nothing, will make you fugitives or exiles, will force you to live in hiding or in poverty. I cannot stop that, but I can give you this, a treasure that the government cannot find, a treasure that will wait for you, a treasure that grows more valuable as the trees grow taller. Each tree has something beneath it, cash, gold, or documents. The cash will help you survive. The gold will help you rebuild. The documents will help you reclaim what is rightfully yours. Together, these 500 trees represent everything I could not give you: security, stability, a future. But you must be patient. You must wait until the trees are mature, until they are 30 years old, until they are valuable enough that harvesting them makes sense. If you dig them up too early, if you harvest the treasure before the trees are grown, you will draw attention. You will make people suspicious. You will risk losing everything. But if you wait, if you let the trees grow, if you harvest them when the time is right, nobody will question it. Nobody will suspect that beneath each tree is a fortune. They will just think you are logging. Just think you are selling timber. Just think you are making a normal business decision. Ernesto has a map. He knows where every tree is planted. He knows what is beneath each one. Find him. Ask him. He is loyal. He will help you. And when you harvest the trees, when you recover the treasure, use it wisely. Use it to build a life that I could not give you. Use it to be better than I was. Use it to make something good from all the bad that I have done. I love you both. I am sorry for the life I have given you. I am sorry for the pain I have caused. But I hope these trees, these 500 investments in your future, will help you forgive me. Will help you understand that everything I did for you. Your father, Pablo. The letter was published by Colombian authorities in April 2025, and the reaction was immediate and complex. Some people were moved by it, said it showed that Pablo loved his children, that he was trying to provide for them even after his death, that the trees were a father's final gift to his kids. Others were angry, said the money was blood money, that it had been earned through violence and suffering, that Pablo's children had no right to, that it should be seized by the government and used to compensate Pablo's victim. Juan Pablo Escobar, now in his late 40s and living under a different name in Argentina, issued a statement. I never knew about the trees. My father never told me. Ernesto never contacted me. I have lived my entire adult life trying to distance myself from my father's legacy. I do not want this money. I do not want this treasure. It represents everything I have spent my life trying to escape. The Colombian government should seize it, should use it to help the victims of my father's violence. That is the only good that can come from this. Manuela Escobar, who had lived in hiding since her father's death and had never spoken publicly, did not comment. Ernesto Vargas, now 77 years old, was tracked down by journalists in May 2025. They asked him about the trees, about the map, about why he'd never told Pablo's children. Ernesto's answer was simple. Pablo told me to plant the trees, told me to keep the secret, told me that his children would find them when the time was right. I did what he asked. I planted 500 trees. I buried 500 containers. I kept the secret for 32 years. I assumed Pablo had given the map to his family before he died. I assumed they knew. When I realized they didn't know, when I realized Pablo had died before he could tell them, I didn't know what to do. I thought about contacting them, but I didn't know how to find them. Didn't know if they'd believe me. Didn't know if telling them would put them in danger. So I stayed silent, kept the secret, waited to see what would happen. And now the trees have been found. Now the secret is out. And I am glad, because it means I can finally stop carrying this burden. Can finally stop wondering if I should have done something. The journalists asked, do you regret planting the trees? No, I was doing my job. Pablo paid me to plant trees. I planted trees. What was buried beneath them was not my concern. I was a gardener. I planted things. That's what I did. Do you think Pablo's children should get the money? That's not for me to decide. I'm just a gardener. I planted the trees. What happens to what's beneath them is not my business. By the end of 2025, investigators had located 312 of the original 500 trees, had recovered $47 million in cash and gold. The remaining 188 trees were either dead, cut down years ago, or located on properties that couldn't be accessed. The Colombian government seized all the recovered treasure, announced that it would be used to fund programs for victims of drug violence, announced that none of it would go to Pablo's family. But the story of the trees became one of the most discussed tales from the Pablo Escobar era. Not because of the money, $47 million was a lot, but Pablo had made billions. But because of what the trees represented, because of the long-term planning, because of the patience, because of the father trying to provide for his children even after death, because of the gardener who kept a secret for 32 years, because of the letter that showed a side of Pablo that most people had never seen. Not the killer, not the terrorist, but the father who loved his children and wanted to give them a... Environmental groups pointed out the irony. Pablo Escobar, who had destroyed so much of Colombia through violence and corruption, had also created 500 trees, had planted them carefully, had ensured they be maintained, had created green spaces that had provided shade and beauty and oxygen for 32 years. The trees, intended as hiding places for treasure, had become valuable in their own right, had become part of the ecosystem. had become homes for birds and insects, had become landmarks in their communities. Some of the trees that hadn't been cut down were preserved, turned into monuments. Plaques were installed explaining their history, explaining that Pablo Escobar had planted them, that treasure had been buried beneath them, that they represented both the worst and the best of human nature, the criminal trying to hide his wealth and the father trying to provide for his children. The trees became tourist attractions. People visited them, took photographs, marveled at the idea that beneath these ordinary trees had been hidden millions of dollars for 3 decades. Ernesto Vargas died in December 2025, 7 months after the trees were discovered. His obituary mentioned that he'd been a gardener for 61 years, that he'd worked for Pablo Escobar, that he'd planted the 500 trees that had hidden $47 million, that he'd kept the secret for 32 years, that he'd been loyal to the end. At his funeral, one of his grandchildren said, "My grandfather was a simple man. He planted trees. He kept secrets. He did his job. He never judged, never questioned, just did what he was asked to do." Some people say he should have told the authorities about the treasure, should have reported it, should have helped seize it. But my grandfather didn't think that way. He thought, Pablo paid me to plant trees. I planted trees. What was beneath them was Pablo's business, not mine. That was his code. That was his integrity. And he lived by it until the day he died. The story of Pablo Escobar's 500 trees remains one of the most fascinating tales from the drug war. A story about long-term planning, about a father's love, about a gardener's loyalty, about treasure hidden in plain sight for 32 years, about trees that were meant to be harvested for money but became valuable for entirely different. And it raises questions that have no easy answers. Was Pablo's plan brilliant or foolish? Was Ernesto's silence loyalty or complicity? Should the treasure have gone to Pablo's children or to his victim? Were the trees a gift or a curse? What's undeniable is that Pablo Escobar, even in death, even 32 years after he was killed, still had the power to surprise, still had secrets waiting to be discovered, still had plans that were only now coming to fruition. The 500 trees were his final trick, his last treasure, his ultimate insurance policy. And they prove that sometimes the best hiding place is not in the ground or in a vault or in a foreign bank account. Sometimes the best hiding place is in plain sight, growing, living, becoming part of the landscape, waiting for the right moment to reveal their secrets. 500 trees, $47 million, 32 years, and one gardener who kept the secret until the world finally discovered what Pablo Escobar had planted all those years.